Hello, friends. You are on Ruslan Belov's channel, and before you is another daily review of the combat situation on the Ukrainian direction. Once again, Witkoff is making statements claiming that, supposedly, there is literally only one last step left until peace. That peace might be achieved quite soon, almost as early as March, and that the conflict will come to an end. However, let us take a sober look at the real state of affairs. We heard similar talk throughout the entirety of last year, in the spring, in the summer, and then in the autumn. Back then they said peace would be concluded by the end of the year, then by the new year, then in January. Now the calendar already shows February 8th, and the positions of the parties remain so far apart that it is extremely difficult to speak of any kind of compromise. Is Zelensky ready to withdraw the armed forces of Ukraine from Donbass by March? Obviously not. Then what kind of peace can we even talk about? Has Europe abandoned the idea of introducing a so-called peacekeeping contingent onto the territory of Ukraine after the signing of a possible agreement? Also no, on the contrary, European politicians are speaking about this quite openly. At the same time, Lavrov directly states that such forces will be viewed as legitimate military targets, which means this will not bring any peace. So what kind of peace by March can we even discuss? Is Ukraine ready to internationally recognize Donbass as part of Russian territory? Here, the answer is also negative. Under these conditions, talk of a peace agreement as early as this spring looks, to put it mildly, unrealistic. Personally, I consider such a scenario practically unfeasible. But as they say, we shall wait and see. Meanwhile, combat operations continue, and you and I continue to carefully analyze the current situation. Yes, the last few days were relatively quiet and not very eventful on the front line, for quite understandable reasons that I have already mentioned, including disruptions in the operation of Starlink. However, the past 24 hours have, one might say, more than compensated for this information lull. A lot of different news has come from the front. There were alarming moments, but overall there were more positive reports. Let us start with one of those pieces of positive news. Just yesterday, in our episode, we analyzed the advancement of Russian units in the area of Chuganovka. Well, as a result of those battles, the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in this sector essentially crumbled, and the soldiers of the North grouping managed to take the settlement completely under control. To be honest, I did not expect such a development of events. Before this, the advancement was going extremely difficultly, and there was a feeling that Russian forces might get bogged down here for a long time, much like what happened in the area of Volchansky Khutori, where battles were fought literally for every house, and progress was measured in minimal distances. It seemed that taking Chuganovka completely would require at least another month. However, the situation turned out quite differently. Everything happened significantly faster. Moreover, if you look at the map, it is clear that they managed to take control not only of the settlement itself, but also of the forest area to the north of it, the forest belt stretching along the entire village, as well as a section of the forest south of Chuganovka. This is an extremely important point, as the complete clearing of the adjacent forest zones significantly reduces the risk of counterattacks by the armed forces of Ukraine, and increases the stability of Russian positions inside the settlement itself. In addition, the capture of Chuganovka has operational significance. Russian forces are essentially breaking out in the direction of Olkovatka. Perhaps this is not yet direct approaches in the full sense of the word. However, the road to a larger settlement is now open. The distance to it from current positions is a little over 3 kilometers. Of course, it must be understood that there will be no easy stroll here. Olkovatka is a fairly large village, and resistance there will surely be serious. Nevertheless, the general direction of further movement is already obvious. We are talking about the interfluve and a subsequent link-up with units operating in the Volchansk sector. The scheme here looks as follows. If from the direction of Volchansk, Russian units reach the area of Bely Kolodez, and from this direction reach Olkovatka, then a meeting is possible further on in the area of Prikolotnoye or Lozovaya. In that case, the entire territory to the north, which is about 700 square kilometers, will find itself in an operational blockade. It is precisely this task that is considered one of the key goals in the Kharkiv region for the current year. You and I discussed this back at the very beginning of January, when we were analyzing the goals for 2026. Back then, we spoke specifically about the necessity of a pincer movement to close this triangle. And now we see that there are indeed certain developments in this direction. As a result, over the past 24 hours, units of the North grouping took control of one settlement and more than 7 square kilometers of territory. Moving on. By the way, I almost forgot to mention one point. During the clearing of the forest area, the soldiers discovered the bodies of frozen servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. Regarding Kupiansk, no significant news has been received over the past 24 hours. However, further south, the situation turned out to be much more tense. Problems arose for both the Russian side and the armed forces of Ukraine. For the Russian troops, difficulties persist in the long-suffering Zagrizovo. As can be seen, Ukrainian units once again managed to enter the settlement and regain control over several streets. Essentially, the same seesaw continues. Russian forces had already taken the village, then lost it, then occupied it again, then withdrew again. Now the settlement has been taken for the third time, but as we see, the situation still remains unstable. It will likely only be possible to finally resolve the issue with Zagrizovo after the complete liquidation of this salient. At the same time, serious problems began for the armed forces of Ukraine in Boguslavka. Here, Russian units managed to break through the defense, enter the village, and occupy 2 streets as well as half of a third. However, the key task remains the complete occupation of the settlement and reaching the Oskol River. Only in this case will it be possible to completely cut off the supply possibilities for the Ukrainian forces from the southern direction. In the south, there are also problems for the Russian army. In the area of Borovskaya Andreevka, the armed forces of Ukraine were able to enter the village again, as a result of which the Russian side lost full control over it. Unfortunately, the Borovaya sector remains exactly what it was, a difficult direction where advancement is achieved with great effort. Nevertheless, it is worth emphasizing that these difficulties are incomparable to the problems that are now rapidly mounting for the armed forces of Ukraine further south in the Ry Alexandrovka direction. It is enough to simply look at the map. Firstly, Russian units managed to advance in the area of Reznikovka on a front about 7.5 kilometers wide. Yes, the depth of advancement varies in different sectors, but the scale itself looks quite impressive. North of Reznikovka, the advancement amounted to between 1 and 2 kilometers, and we are not talking about flat fields, but about movement across heights and through rugged hilly terrain. In Reznikovka itself, Russian forces advanced through residential buildings for a distance of approximately 1 kilometer and 300 meters. In fact, only the western outskirts remain under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine, while the main part of the settlement is already under the control of Russian units. South of Reznikovka, another pocket was liquidated, where the depth of advancement was about 3 kilometers. The total area of territory that passed to the control of the soldiers of the South grouping exceeded 13 square kilometers. This is exactly why I say that the local problems of Russian troops in the area of Borovaya or Zagrizovo are completely incomparable to the crisis currently unfolding for the armed forces of Ukraine in the Ry Alexandrovka direction. But that is not all. If we go even further south, the picture for the Ukrainian side becomes quite bleak. A virtual local collapse of the defense occurred here. The armed forces of Ukraine lost the heights south of Pazeno, lost the settlements of Bondanoye and Kromovka, and also lost control over an extensive area in the pocket between Nelipovsky and Vasyukovka, which was completely cleared by Russian units. The area of territory that passed to Russia's control in this sector exceeded 17 square kilometers. Thus, in the Ry Alexandrovka direction alone, over the past 24 hours, the armed forces of Ukraine lost more than 30 square kilometers of territory. If this is not a collapse, then what can be called a collapse? In this sector, one more height remains to be taken under control, where units of the armed forces of Ukraine continue to hold positions. After that, the pocket between Privolie and Bondanoye will be completely cleared, and Russian forces will be able to reach the area of Fedorovka Vtoraya. And this, in turn, will become an extremely alarming signal for the garrison of the armed forces of Ukraine located directly in Ry Alexandrovka, Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporizhzhia direction. The Russian army continues to develop its offensive from Gulyai Pol deep into the Zaporizhzhia region. Units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation are advancing west of Gulyai and are entering deeper into the settlement of Zaliznichnye. The total area of advancement in this sector reaches approximately 9.5 square kilometers. At the present moment, the main part of Zaliznichnye is under Russian control. In addition, Russian units entered Krynichnye and are breaking out on a wide front in the direction of Tsvetkovoye. From the side of Konstantinovka, the advancement is going through a gully toward Vozdvizhevka. It was specifically in this sector that an assault group of the armed forces of Ukraine, employing armored vehicles supported by a tank, attempted to break through the Russian defense. The attack attempt was repelled, and the Ukrainian side suffered significant losses. Despite this, the armed forces of Ukraine continue to transfer reserves to the Verkhnyaya Tersa, Vozdvizhevka, Rozdestvenskoye area, striving to prevent the Russian units from reaching the Novonikolaevka to Orekov road. From the Ivanovka to Filia direction, Russian troops advanced approximately 3 kilometers toward Tarasovka and Fedorovka. In the Zaporizhzhia sector, advancement of the armed forces of the Russian Federation was also recorded in the areas of Pavlovka and Novoyakovlevka. Pokrovsk direction, heavy and fierce battles for Grishino continue here. Russian units are consistently expanding the encirclement of Belitskoye, and south of this settlement they are advancing towards Svetloye. According to information from Yuri Podolyaka, a significant part of Novy Donbass is already under the control of the Russian army. In parallel, the armed forces of the Russian Federation are systematically increasing the control zone around Toretsk, developing an offensive in a northwesterly direction, toward the deposit of refractory and fire-resistant clays. Konstantinovka direction. Intensive military clashes continue in the southeastern part of Konstantinovka. Russian units have managed to expand their control zone in the area of Ilyanovka. The advancement is proceeding along the T-0504 highway, while simultaneously cutting off a section of the road in the area of Pretichino. Advancement is also noted in the Dacha communities east of Konstantinovka. Fighting does not cease in the area of the railway station and in the eastern part of the city, Krasny Liman sector. Here, Russian troops are conducting offensive operations to the north and west of Krasny Liman, while simultaneously strengthening positions south of Stavki. The clearing of positions east of this area continues. An offensive is developing in the direction of Sosnovoye. Units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation have reached a key defensive line of the armed forces of Ukraine, Alexandrovka and Korovy Yar, thereby creating a threat to the last land supply corridor for the Borovaya grouping of Ukrainian troops. Simultaneously, Russian drones have effectively paralyzed the delivery of fuel along the Pavlograd to Pokrovsk highway, which has significantly increased pressure on the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine. Overall, despite individual local successes of the Ukrainian side, the past 24 hours clearly belong to the Russian army. It is enough to simply compare the figures. Over the last day, the armed forces of Ukraine did not take control of a single settlement, and in terms of territory, they were able to win back about 4.5 square kilometers. The Russian side has 3 occupied settlements and approximately 38 square kilometers of territory. The difference, as they say, is obvious: 4.5 versus 38. At the same time, there were additional successes in other sectors of the front. However, they have not yet been reflected on the maps. Therefore, we will return to them later, as soon as the cartographers update the data. I think some of the changes will be noted as early as today, and then we will discuss them in one of the next episodes. With that, I conclude the review of the situation on the front line for today. Now let's briefly go over the latest news that directly affects what is happening on the front lines. The Kremlin has refuted Zelensky's statements. A new round of negotiations on Ukraine is indeed expected. However, it will not take place in the United States. This was reported by the press secretary of the President of Russia, Dmitry Peskov, who specified that there is no specific date for the negotiations yet, and no discussions about holding a meeting in the United States have been conducted. We remind you that a day earlier, Zelensky stated that a new round of negotiations could take place exactly there. According to our source, the so-called Arab negotiation track on the Ukrainian crisis has effectively exhausted itself. Breakthroughs within its framework should not be expected. This platform will most likely remain only as a place for meetings, consultations, and exchanges, roughly in the same format as it was previously. At the same time, each of the parties will publicly claim the success of such contacts. It is also reported that Ukraine insists on obtaining security guarantees for Odessa within the framework of a possible peace plan. According to the source, for Kyiv, this is one of the key and fundamental points. The Ukrainian side understands that in the future, military operations could potentially unfold precisely around Odessa, and therefore it is trying to secure certain guarantees in advance. However, the question remains open: who will answer for the events of May 2nd? We remind you that Vladimir Putin previously stated that Odessa could become either an apple of discord or a symbol of conflict resolution, as well as a point for finding a way out of the current crisis. For now, everything that is happening points only toward further escalation. There is no talk of any imminent peace. Separately, the language issue is worth noting. In Israel, the Arabic language is not prohibited. In Palestine and Arab countries, Hebrew is not prohibited. Nowhere is a language under a ban. And only in Ukraine is the language of the indigenous population of these territories prohibited, which is also an official language of the United Nations. Attempts to consolidate the existing regime under the cover of security guarantees, regardless of the territory, look unacceptable. In essence, within the framework of the negotiations in the United Arab Emirates, only technical points related to a possible disengagement of forces after the end of the war were discussed. However, the key conditions for peace are still rejected by the Ukrainian side. We are talking about the withdrawal of troops from Donbass, security guarantees without the presence of NATO forces, the protection of the rights of the Russian-speaking and Orthodox population, and likely a revision of the constitution, where the course toward joining NATO is established. That is, the format of how to live after the war is seemingly being discussed, but Ukraine is not ready to end the war itself. The approach is formally constructive, but no prospects are visible in it as of yet. That concludes our situational review for today. Thank you for watching and for your continued interest in these updates. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our work. We will continue to monitor the situation and keep you informed of all further developments. I wish you all peace and safety. Until next time, goodbye.